Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by Cameron and Stella from the Mercuranians podcast, who are joining me. They're driving through Denver right now on their way back from the Northwest Astrology Conference. So, hey, welcome, and thanks for joining me.
Yeah,
hello,
thank you.
hello.
Thank you so much for having us here. We're just ecstatic to be here with you.
Yeah.
Such a pleasure.
It's always good to meet up with other fellow astrology podcasters, and it just sort of fell together this way. We didn't really plan it, but today's actually the day of a Mercury-Uranus conjunction, so it's actually kind of perfect for our meeting today in terms of the name of your podcast.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, our name comes from Mercury and Uranus, right? Mercuranian. And it's just like bizarre how perfectly that aligned. We couldn't have elected it even if we wanted to.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's here's our chart for right now for the moment. So it's a Mercury-Uranus conjunction at 20 degrees of Taurus. Cool. All right. So you're coming back. You're doing a road trip on the way back from the Northwest Astrology Conference. This wasn't your first conference. You've both been to other conferences before. What conference? How many have you been to?
I think this is my 5th conference over the last few years in person. But yeah, I've been to Norwalk, ISAR, also the Astrology Gathering out in Lilydale, New York. Yeah, I volunteered with Stella. Last year we were both there.
What year was your first conference?
2021 at that
Okay.
conference in Lilydale.
Got it.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. And I skipped out on the 2021 Lilydale, but I was at Norwalk last year, then ISAR, and then the Astrology Gathering that fall. So this was number 4 for me.
Got it.
Yeah, the Astrology Gathering isn't like a super popular one, but it's really, really fun, really close, kind of more of an intimate conference. It's in like a super spiritual town. So that was a really nice contrast from ISAR and Norwalk.
Yeah.
Did you both do Norwalk last year?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what was the comparison? Because I know one of the comments I heard, I think Austin told me after when I got the debrief, because I wasn't able to make it this year, he said that it felt like a little bit more congealed, like people were more coming together because many people had gone to the last year's conference, which was the first one back since the pandemic. I guess they took 2 years off from doing in-person conferences after they did their one in 2019. So they did 2022 last year was the first one back in person again, but there's so many new people in the community. And part of meeting up with conferences is catching up with old friends that you've seen at previous conferences. So was that sort of a vibe in terms of this year being the second one back, that it was a lot of reconnecting with people you had seen last year?
Yeah, very, very palpable. I mean, last year was Mars and Jupiter together in Aries, right? It's like it was totally all over the place like that. There was just so many meeting new people, new things. Like everything was very, very new for me, especially because it was my first conference ever. But this year you saw a lot of familiar faces, names and stuff like that. And while it was less, I don't know, chaotic, it was still like really, really fun.
Yeah, that was nice though, because to me it felt like a 1 year change, I guess, like the Jupiter and Aries, the Mars conjunct, like you said. It was, there was just a lot of commotion, and this year it did feel a little more contained, a little bit more, I guess, expected or stable. Everything went relatively well. Everyone had a great time. So I thought it was a spectacular weekend.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. I mean, like last year there were dozens of people in the lobby until well after midnight.
Yeah, I have to say, we were in like a 6 a.m. sunrise gang, and this year it was like the lobby was dead after midnight. I was a little disappointed because
on a Friday night.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was nobody down there.
Yeah, I was really surprised by that, actually. It was very early to bed for a lot of people, I guess.
Yeah, maybe people were conserving their energy a little bit better compared to last year.
Yeah, probably that. Yeah.
For the better. At least on the first night.
Right. Well, that sounds good. So conferences are so important because one of the differences is just like the online astrological community these days versus in-person ones. And I know over a decade ago, around 2010 or so, when I was the president of the Association for Young Astrologers, so much of what we try to do is find ways to do scholarships and things to help younger people get to conferences, because that's one of the places where you can really interface with the existing established astrological community, and that's really important, and you don't really understand the importance of it until you get there in person and actually experience it.
Totally.
So were you guys able to connect with a lot of different astrologers just from different generations and eras?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like that's one of the most beautiful things about being at an astrology conference is because, everywhere you go, you're going to meet someone who you can automatically have an hours-long conversation with, and it doesn't matter how old you are, whether they're, someone in their 20s talking to someone in their 60s. It's like everyone's just there to meet and share their passion and love for astrology. So it's a really welcoming environment. And definitely, though, like off of what you were saying about the importance of that kind of connection compared to digital spaces, I think it's really, really important. And just there's nowhere else you can go to find a community like that. And I know for myself last year, like at NORWAC, I met 2 other people from my city in Salem, Massachusetts, where a few months afterwards, we actually started a local astrology group now out of Salem. And that wouldn't have happened if we didn't meet up at NORWAC first. So yeah, it's a special opportunity for sure.
Yeah, there's sometimes things like that happen that are unique that can only happen when people get up and meet in person, because it's kind of like different atoms that are like, shooting around inside a glass jar. And then sometimes there's these collisions that you can't anticipate until they happen. One of the things I was reflecting on actually as it was happening this year that I realized afterwards, I was thinking about the early history of the traditional revival and how Project Hindsight got started at a United Astrology Conference in 1992 when Robert Hand and Robert Zoller and Robert Schmidt and his wife Ellen Black met up in person and like formulated this idea of doing some sort of archive for historical astrological texts. And I think that was the original name, was like Arhat. But then by the next year, they had formulated this idea of doing this unique subscription service, translating astrological texts, and then releasing them to subscribers who signed up to get a new one every time a new one came out. And they announced that for the first time at the Northwest Astrology Conference in Seattle in 1983. So it was really interesting because this meant this was the 30-year anniversary of that announcement of Project Hindsight originally, and just how much things have changed in the past 30 years and how that's sort of transformed, or has been one of the things that's transformed the astrological community.
Yeah. I mean, that's huge. Even just the internet alone, I'm sure, has done crazy things for like the community. I can't even imagine what it would be like to not have just like limitless sources at my fingertips. But like per your earlier comment about like being online and in like the digital community versus being at a conference and like actually getting to speak with people, there's so much like beauty and value to that, because you hear about these kinds of projects that are budding up, right? You hear these kinds of conversations between astrologers where they're like, oh yeah, we're doing X project, keep an eye out for it later this year. Or there's like the free like note cards and posters section where there's like all of this little stuff that you can look out for, and you would never know that, right? And I don't know, sometimes interactions between like differing schools of thought online can be so abrasive.
Right.
Whereas like at a conference, when you run into somebody who doesn't share your same viewpoint, you're both immersed and ready to learn. Whereas that dynamic does not really carry over onto the internet.
Right. And I think also, especially with what you were saying about it being, this 30-year major cycle completion for the community and for the world, in terms of the revival of traditional astrology, like I think that was really alive and like felt at this conference, because there was almost more discussion in the sense of like, all right, like now this stuff is out, these techniques are, being practiced and written about, and we can kind of all see it coming alive, like everything is, working as it should. But now we're kind of at this crossroads of like integrating the technical skill that we have at our fingertips now from all of that ancient material with, the perspective that, 20th century astrology sort of began to bring in the lens of, counseling and, depth psychology, and now it's just kind of like this merger point between those two perspectives. Like Stephen Forrest Evening Keynote kind of spoke to that journey that we're on as a community now. So I think a lot of people were talking about that as well in that stage that we've kind of crossed, like you brought up.
Of synthesizing things as a community?
Yeah, or just kind of navigating how, the soulful element, and everyone has their own practice. Everyone's going to approach things differently, but how we can holistically incorporate, the psycho-spiritual element to an astrological practice that's still really well grounded in technique and in tradition.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question in terms of, once you can do something technically and that's been accomplished, like what you should do or how you can find a way for it to be helpful or healing to a client rather than just something that's just impressive from a technical standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I'm being reminded of like Eric Perdue's like recent lecture at NORWAC on finding the name of your Daimon, right? Of your Daimon, and using like the Hebrew alphabet and a number of different steps you can find the name. And finding the name might be like, oh, okay, cool. Now what? Like, cool name. Should I get it tattooed? Or it can be something that you immerse in your spiritual practice that you really like take to heart and use in a metaphysical way. And I think it's like really wrong to kind of, I'm not saying that you did this, but to kind of like say like, oh, like traditional astrologers are like less spiritual or
Sure, yeah.
Modern astrology is like too esoteric. Like that's not really, it's a little bit extreme, like on both ends. But I think you catch my drift.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's an incredibly soulful element to ancient astrology still. I mean, a lot of the great philosophical discussion that you've brought up on the podcast about different elements of, I guess the spiritual component of someone's nativity or birth chart that can be discovered. But yeah, I think it's just this kind of, like we were saying, it's this merger point where, it can be impressive from a technical standpoint, and it can be, almost like I feel like, for myself, in the younger stages of my lifelong kind of practice with astrology, I know it can kind of feel like a bit of an ego trip at first, because it's like when you start seeing it working and you start doing more readings, and it can feel like kind of all powerful, like you can read the future, the past, or anything. But I think it's important that like practitioners are able to be, all of us can be grounded in the sense that, people are coming to us as practitioners because they need or guidance, or help, or, whatever it may be in any kind of situation. So I think it's just, a good jumping off point for more discussion in the community about how that can kind of blend the best of both worlds as we move into the future.
Yeah, that might be a good like Saturn and Pisces discussion that we'll have over the course of the next 3 years. Because that does tend to be a more compassionate sign, and versus the past 6 years of Saturn transiting through first Capricorn and then Aquarius, and some of that's at least coincided a little bit with the popularization, some people have noted, of traditional astrology in a more mainstream sense over the past 6 years. So yeah, that could be an interesting like dimension of that. I keep thinking about how in the 50s or 60s, when Saturn was in Pisces, the example I used on the year ahead forecast that Nick Dagan Best shared with me about how major television channels in the United States switched from black and white television to color television as Saturn was going through Pisces, and it was sort of like accomplished during that period. And just this idea of seeing that kind of change, not just on a technical level in different parts of society, but also in other areas like that, like perhaps in astrology or things like that.
Yeah, I love that you brought up this kind of analogy of viewing something in color versus in black and white, right? Mm-hmm. And when you think about how much energy had to go into the reconstruction of the tradition, right? All of the projects and everything that came with it. You don't really have the time to color in all of these things and make them magical as you're discovering them and uncovering them. But now that we have a much clearer framework, we can build these like beautiful, we can color it, right? We have the basics, there's not basics, there's a whole tradition, and there's lots that we still have to uncover. But I think you caught my drift. It's just there, like the spiritual engrossment within your astrological practice, as the ancients did, is something that I think is also coming back.
Yeah, I think the revival of astrological magic is just getting started, which is going hand in hand with all of this. And that's really where I see the next dimension of this fusion happening where more people are empowered to work on a spiritual level with the spirits, the daimons, the planets, the guardians of this reality, you know, however, you know, an astrologer would or could advise them to, based off of some kind of principle of, you know, remediation or working with difficult planets or placements or challenging or obstacles, you know, things in the chart that present difficult life circumstances. How can we work with those and attune ourselves to changing our internal perspective or spiritual perspective that causes that kind of outer shift in our reality that we experience externally?
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff about the Daimon that I've been researching recently in ancient astrology and how that was conceptualized and how you had the place of, you know, good Daimon, which was the 11th house, and bad Daimon, which is the 12th house, and how the different astrologers conceptualized that in the Hellenistic tradition, as well as the notion that a lot of the major philosophies of like Hermeticism and Gnosticism and Neoplatonism shared about the soul descending through the planetary spheres and picking up these qualities from the planets that after death you like give up as the soul ascends through the planetary spheres, and how that's tied in with some of that, and how that in and of itself may have been the original, or at least the traditional approach to psychological astrology, essentially was associating the planets with those qualities or properties of the soul that you sort of get upon incarnating or what have you. Yeah. So it'd be interesting to see how things like that might be looked at within the context of modern astrology, or how that might gel with some of the modern notions of psychological astrology.
Yeah. I mean, even the celestial spheres, right? That school of thought emerged like pre-Copernican revolution, right? They thought there were fixed crystalline spheres around the Earth. And there was a scientific element to that, right? Astrology and science were one. But now we've kind of had this divergence, right? Where it's forked off into two different things. Astrology is not science anymore. And so, I don't know, the spheres and the idea of a soul trickling down through these different concrete things which exist out in space around the Earth, maybe a reimagining of that that's a little bit more attuned to our physical knowledge today, or our scientific knowledge today, I guess would be better, might come about like during this time too. Or maybe it's not you're dripping through the spheres, you're collecting them with your gravity or something. Yeah.
I feel like it's just like everyone's personal natal chart is your own unique map towards how you're going to ascend back out one day. You know, the way that we can all prepare ourselves to relinquish those vices that each of the planets kind of offer, like in the Corpus Hermeticum, what you were referencing, that journey to, withdrawal, the consciousness of the mind or the soul from the senses of the body. In a very general way, you know, that's going to be specialized and detailed for everyone in their own birth chart, you know, based off of what kinds of imbalances their chart is making them predisposed to working with that energy in that kind of remedial context, like we were talking about. I really do believe is an incredibly potent step that anyone can begin to take in terms of if you're searching for something to enhance or alter your spiritual direction, you know, working with the natal chart in that context is, your personal gateway into divinity.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's one of the questions, you know, that some of those philosophies had in the ancient world were either a neutrality or sometimes like an antipathy towards the physical world and the physical incarnation, because the Gnostic religious sects or different philosophies had a much more like negative version of that. The material world is bad and we are trapped here, and the planetary spheres are like gatekeepers that are keeping us trapped and almost like distracting us in a way with these different things that they're associated with in the material world, and that our goal is to get the hell out of here and get back to the source somehow. And while some of the Hermetic texts had some of that, there were others that were a little bit more neutral to positive about the physical world, and didn't take it necessarily that negative of a thing. So it's just interesting when you're mentioning like, or when modern astrologers are mentioning synthesizing, like a religious or philosophical approach with ancient or with technical approaches, one of the questions is just like, whose philosophy or what philosophy are we synthesizing? Because just different people with different religious or philosophical views come from wildly different perspectives in terms of how they approach astrology. And that's one of the tricky things is the astrology itself is somewhat neutral. And so you can't necessarily assume a specific philosophical or religious approach just because somebody's an astrologer.
Yeah. It's a hard debate. There's going to be no correct answer to it. Everyone's going to have to find that for themselves. But I do think ultimately, like, at the end of the day, we all have to prepare our body to leave our body one day. And I think that the way that, we can all go about doing that is going to come down to just how can you find balance and harmony in your life. And if the natal chart is in any way a map towards what you can do or what your potential is, then maximizing that effect towards finding a sense of purpose in your life, I think, is the bottom line, that everyone could agree on, at least.
Yeah, well, that's a good idea, is establishing like what the bottom line is that all astrologers could agree on. And it would have to be some very basic things like that the birth chart, the alignment of the planets and the cosmos, the moment a person is born, has something to say about their future and what will happen in their life, either internally or externally in their future. And also that it may relate to some extent to their telling you something about the meaning of the person's life in the broadest sense. I guess those are two things that we could say is true no matter what philosophical approach or school of astrology you're approaching things from.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I don't know if we will ever reach a point in the modern era where we have widespread astrological consensus and synthesis over, let alone techniques, God forbid, like philosophy and your religious views independent of astrology now, right? Because we did have that divide historically where astrology was no longer science and it's no longer religion. It's something kind of in between and both at the same time. And so when you have so many differing schools of thought, I think that one of our goals as a community should be not to form a consensus, but to ensure that there's space for all of them. And that to be able to put yourself maybe in a different school of thought and further your practice by doing so, right? There's plenty, I mean, a very simple example of this would be Western astrologers studying like Jyotish, right? Where you put yourself in a different school of thought, right? You put on a different cultural lens to look at astrology through, and you see how that reframes not only your practice, but your worldview and your own divinatory practice or spiritual practice in general.
Yeah, I see people, one of the prerequisites for that people often don't understand when they're studying different traditions or approaches is to try as much as you can to drop all of your preconceptions and all of your own personal beliefs going into it and just experiment like with what if I just embraced this approach in its entirety in terms of its philosophy and its techniques and everything else and just tried it out for a period of time, almost as if you're trying on a new pair of clothes, or if you're trying out like a new profession and you're just like you're playing that role for a period of time. Because one of the things I think people don't do or do that can be problematic when trying out different traditions is they hold on too much to whatever their pre-existing assumptions about things are. And I see that sometimes when people, I don't know, like somebody asks if they study Hellenistic astrology, can they, use whatever house system instead of the one that was used most then, or can they use these, rulerships for the signs of the zodiac instead of the traditional rulerships or what have you, or with Jyotish, different questions like that. Can I still use whatever Western approach and import that into? And usually the best thing is instead just to sort of start with a blank slate and learn things and just understand it on its own terms first. And then later, if you want to modify things, that's okay. But at least you've given it an honest shot first, I think is usually a good piece of advice.
Yeah. And I think it's also just hard to even ask people or to be even ready to do that, because astrology is just inherently so non-binary that we don't want to like accept at first that something could be so self-contradictory and still work so well in so many different ways. Like there's so many different ways we can encounter those kinds of paradoxical binaries generally in the study of astrology. And I think that's not easy to like approach it. You know, that I think that's why it is so esoteric, because it is the ultimate blend of as above, you know, so below. It's this irreconcilable fusion of two different worlds, and all we can do is just, like you said, really start from the basics and from the beginnings and observe slowly what you find to be true and just aggregate that over time. And everyone does that in a totally different way, which is also what's really cool. And which is also what's really cool about going to these conferences and meeting other people who, you know, maybe practice some totally eclectic blend of, you know, Uranian and Hellenistic astrology or whatever it is nowadays. It's just really cool because it's that non-binary element of astrology, that mercurial piece of it, that makes it so vacillating yet so uncontained and boundless.
Yeah, that's something I keep going back and forth and what to call it, and I sometimes call it the mercurial element of astrology, but I don't know if that, because of the connotations that mercurial has today of something different, I don't know if that's a good term, or sometimes I call it like the hermetic nature of astrology. But just in traditional astrology, Mercury was ruled or astrology was ruled by Mercury or by Hermes, and that part of the insight into that, if you always keep that in mind, is just that whenever you come to an issue where it looks like there's two different options that equally seem to be true, like the answer, and that it's an either or situation, usually the answer is often that it's both in some way, or there's pieces that are both true in different ways, just in the same way that Mercury comes up in that way over and over again in the technical part of astrology. You know, being the planet that has its joy in the first house, which is partially above the horizon in the daytime part of the chart and partially below the horizon in the nighttime part of the chart. And he plays that vacillating role between those two seemingly opposite paradigms of night and day, or masculine and feminine, or what have you. I think that's also part of what astrology is, just inherently, and is also probably the key to reconciling many of the issues that we find ourselves with these days, due to the revival of ancient and modern astrology, where you have these seemingly wildly different approaches that can't be reconciled, that somehow finding a reconciliation is possible by understanding that both can be true in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, to simmer on like modern understandings of that, right? Like, a lot of modern astrologers give astrology to Uranus, right? Like, if you have Uranus really prominent in the 9th or something, you're an astrologer. And well, Uranus is also a psychopomp, right? I don't think that Uranus rules Aquarius, but it can only be seen when it's opposite the sun. What's opposite the sun's domicile? Aquarius, right? And so, like, while I don't personally use Uranus as the ruler of Aquarius, it's still, you can see how clearly that can be woven into the pre-existing traditional schema, right? You don't have to go out with Saturn and in with Uranus, but it's pretty striking that you can only see this planet when it's opposite the sun. And what's opposite the sun? The sun's domicile. And like, Uranus also has this psychopomp nature that Mercury has, where it weaves between the spheres of the celestial sphere, the highest sphere, and it makes its way back into Saturn's sphere, I guess you could say, or maybe it would have its own little sliver. But weaves its way back into the visible planetary movements, because it's not quite a fixed star, but it will always appear as one to us. And I don't know, there's something very modern, right? That can coexist with the tradition in a way that is not contradictory or offensive to either party involved.
Yeah, I think it's a really like the quantum effect of astrology, you know, is this experiencing how can something be like superpositioned or like in multiple states at once? Like, for instance, with Uranus visibly in the sky, you were saying, you know, it only appears kind of for 1 or 2 days once a year when it's opposite the sun, and it just kind of pops out of nowhere. And it just kind of makes me think of like that classical thought experiment of Schrodinger's cat, just kind of like this little, it's a thought experiment in quantum physics to kind of explore what the math is proving about what scientists are discovering about the nature of the universe, which is showing us that things can be totally paradoxical. You know, something can be measured to be almost simultaneously in two places at once, or affect something on the other side of the universe, and have this totally like synergized or synchronized effect from light years away. And I think astrology is sort of discovering the same thing that science is. We're kind of running on the same parallel track that's like, our human minds can't rationalize, can't put it into a binary. We're not going to be able to, because that's just not how this universe is really designed.
Right. Yeah. In astrology, it's like Schrodinger's house system. It's like, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Is it?
Absolutely.
If we can all just laugh about that, then maybe we can accept that dualities exist and they will forever, and they'll be both and at the same time.
Right. The cat is both in the 12th house and dead, and it's in the 11th house and it's off
having all of
Yeah.
its cat friends.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Frolicking with its friends. Okay. Right. I like that. Yeah, no, I have been actually thinking about that lately, because I had a 4th house, whole sign house, like Mercury retrograde transit recently, the one in Taurus, and it had me reflecting on and like going back to where I grew up, and like going back and seeing sort of my house where I grew up and things like that. It was like a retrograde, and so it was interesting because it was very literal. It was like a returning back to one's home in a very literal way, but also going around and driving around my old neighborhoods and just like seeing how everything had changed over the past 30 years. And in the quadrant houses, Mercury went retrograde in my 3rd house, but in whole sign it was in my 4th. And that was just giving me some insights, because I know the medieval astrologers were trying to reconcile whole sign houses and degree-based forms of house division like Placidus and other quadrant systems. And we see some hints of them trying to say different things. And even in Firmicus, he makes some statements about using both at the same time. But that was giving me some ideas and some insights about that and how you might approach it and how it might truly be both, which is, I know, something a lot of people say or have said anecdotally in different ways. But I think one of the tasks now is to see, is it both in the same way, in that it literally just, they have the same exact meanings and the same purpose and they just operate at the same time, or are there different contexts in which you can use both? That way you have a handle on saying like what each one says, or the way in which each one works, I think is one of the big questions to solve today.
Yeah. Do you want to go?
If you can go ahead if you have something to say.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, like, it makes me think of, like, in physics, you know, the observer effect is like you change the outcome or the physical, I guess, calculation or result of an experiment just by observing it. And it makes me think of like, well, okay, like what is divination then? You know, if people can throw bones or read through smoke or scry into their third eye, you know, it's like, I think it's just that, like, as long as the intention is there to receive a symbol, you know, from the universe, to observe some kind of symbolic result off of what is being, you know, initiated on the diviner's part, you know, we're going to get something. You know, if two different diviners look at the same entrails or look at the same bones, they could say different things sort of in the same way, you know, just like two astrologers that use different house systems are going to kind of unravel the same information. And it's just about that instant observer effect moment of like, I'm going to look at it because this is my symbol set that I work with, and I know if I use it like this, I can say this and it will probably be true. And I think that's just kind of, again, that irreconcilable duality with astrology.
Yeah. I mean, I had a very similar train of thought, but just the idea that, like, I don't know, do you know what angularity is and how the 4 angles can work independently of signs? If you remove the zodiac from the equation, and can you point to a chart where Mars culminates and like know what that means? Can you point it out in the sky? You know, I feel like that serves a distinct purpose. And while it may not be a different purpose, once we divide that into house systems, it has a distinct power to it that is different than when you look at a whole sign system. Because I would never ever read the houses from fortune through a quadrant lens. Like, that's that seems incongruent to me. But like when I was first getting involved with astral magic, I was pretty strictly like whole signs. Like I would use a little bit of quadrant, more emphasis on the angles than anything. And then I started doing magic and I was like, yeah, that Mercury was definitely in the 12th house for this experience that this item just brought to me. So that, I don't know. And like using different systems for different purposes, right? That's also a whole topic in itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard because, again, I think it's just going to come back to everyone is their own best astrologer, right? It's like you're going to, over time, and it's not even about technical skill. To me, it's just about being able to have the acquaintance with a symbol system that is specific enough to you to relay the information you need to someone, whatever it could be about.
Sure. Yeah, and just what the person is asking about as well and what they want to know. So one of the topics that came up earlier that we mentioned briefly is one of you said that you talked to like Rick Levine and he was contrasting like the resources he had when he was starting out as an astrologer versus what's available to all of you. What was the quote from that again?
Yeah, he basically, we were with Rick Levine and he told us this story about how when he was younger, when he was getting into astrology, there were 3 books in the astrology section at a library, maybe 5 if you were lucky, right? And you could check this library and that library, but same copy, you know? There's only so much information that you could even access. But now, I mean, figuring out how to filter through the information that's available to me was a huge step in my learning journey. Like, just being able to figure out what is going to contain the information that I'm looking for, because there's thousands and thousands of blog posts and articles and tweets and all of these things. You have things ranging from like scholarly, like academic papers that you can access on JSTOR to 30-second TikTok videos telling you something else as well. And especially like when you're first starting, that's very overwhelming because like the minute the algorithm learns you're looking into astrology, that's all the content you get too. So I don't know, you have to figure out how to navigate the information that you have available to you. And it's a huge blessing. Like I'm eternally grateful for the fact that I had access to your podcast and publications online and just all of these different voices. It's been such a key component to my practice. But at the same time, it made like my first year like very stressful, honestly. It was really hard to navigate that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting difference for astrologers starting now versus 20 years ago when I was starting, or 30 years ago, or 40, or what have you, and having much more limited resources back then. Like when Rick Levine's talking about an astrologer might have access to like a handful of just like core books that everybody reads, which is like some Dane Rudyard or some like, Rob Hand's Planets in Transit, copy of the Ephemeris. You might be doing charts by hand for that matter, not even having, and even pre-internet, so not having access to that even. When I was starting, the internet was still relatively new in like 1999, 2000, and thankfully Astro.com existed, so I could get free chart calculations, which is crucial. And we don't think about how that's changed because, that's relatively recent innovation, only like 20, 25 years ago now. But even the internet was like much earlier in that time period. So you didn't have like podcasts or like blogs or anything like that necessarily. There were fewer even websites to draw information from. But one of the things that was interesting is that it led to sort of artificially a little bit more consistency, or most people are on the same page more or less, even though there are different approaches or different sort of slightly different approaches to astrology. It led to a little bit more people being on the same page because it was like everybody had read that one Rob Hand book or what have you, versus today there's such a huge amount of resources that people can be coming from like wildly different places in terms of their understanding of astrology. But yeah, that's interesting thinking about how the struggle now is not a lack of resources, but too many. Like even if you just restricted yourself to podcasts, you'd still have like 30 different podcasts or what have you to, or YouTube channels. You'd have like 100 different YouTube channels to, decide which ones to watch. And that's a challenge.
And they have hundreds of hours of content, and you're seeing negative reviews on this one, but excellent reviews on another one, but then you don't quite agree with the worldview or the philosophy of this creator. It's a very nuanced issue. And so, like, while navigating this sea, as you said earlier, it's really important to get your foundations, get your basics, learn something, even if you don't quite agree with it, take it as it is. And then if you want to tweak it a little bit later. Don't be shy to tweak things a little bit, especially depending on who your source is and what you're planning on doing with this information. I'm not saying go ahead and reevaluate the entire dignity schema and claim that that's the way it's supposed to be all along. I'm just saying that if you see something that you don't totally agree with, like, I don't know, Mars in the 9th house makes men who lack intuition, right? But you have Mars in the 9th and you have a great intuition. Keep in mind that there's context to that. Keep in mind that there's always more information out there. And you also probably are not the first person to have thought of your idea. Just like knowing how to look for it can be a little hard on the internet too, because like sometimes you type in an astrological term and Google starts giving you, I don't know, plumbing companies or math. So
yeah, I feel like I often do the Google search of like some random specific thing and nothing comes up, but then I'm like, oh, I have to type astrology afterwards, and then it will generate what I'm looking for.
That's really funny because I had a few years ago, a astrology conference sent me an invitation to speak, but they sent it to a Chris Brennan from Ireland who was like a plumber. And thankfully he didn't accept. And we've later, during a Mercury retrograde, like figured out what had happened when they sent me to my correct email address. But I was able to speak at the conference, but it gave me a great like opening joke for that lecture.
Yeah, that's hilarious. Yeah. Was it the UFC fighter? Or I don't know if it's UFC. There's like a...
No, that's a different guy. Apparently there's a lot more Chris Brennans than I realized, but yeah, we're all battling for the supremacy of the Google search results.
Yeah.
Isn't everybody nowadays?
Right.
Which is a really key part of finding astrological information as well, you know?
Yeah, you have to consider too, like what is circulated is what the algorithm's going to push out more. So the sources that aren't, maybe are more valuable than many others are just not seen, you know? What's hidden will remain hidden. But also I do think like, I don't know, kind of what you were saying, I guess, was kind of making me think of like the quote from this amazing astrologer, William Lilly, who always said, kind of writes like, mix judgment with art, like in the way that you're reading a chart. And I think approaching your own learning journey is very similar in the sense that like, there's an element to which I know for myself, I feel like I was sort of always guided, even if I didn't know where the next step was. It was kind of like, I'm always on a trail of breadcrumbs and it's kind of bringing me somewhere. And astrology is a crazy rat race in that sense because there's no curriculum. There never will be. It's just so vast. And, you know, for everyone, it's just going to come down to, you know, finding, hopefully everyone can, you know, at least studied with, you know, a teacher or a mentor or someone who can be a personal, you know, source of gnosis in a way or experience. But yeah, beyond that, navigating the internet, I think it's just going to take time for more, you know, digital archives to, you know, compile different digital sources or, you know, textbooks that may, or any of these books that become available digitally, you know, as PDFs. I think just as maybe more work is done to make those digital archives, you know, and your website is great, actually. You know, the Hellenistic Astrology website has so much on there, especially for the ancient, like, manuscripts and like facsimile editions of, you know, whatever old scanned books are on there. But yeah, I think it's just going to come down to growing a better collection of credible resources and networks of teachers who are out there and sharing and guiding people.
Yeah, I'm actually in the process of redesigning the Hellenistic website right now.
Oh, wow.
So just want to mention that in case it looks a little wonky in the meantime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
There was something I had to say about that, but I just totally lost it. It'll come back to me eventually.
Yeah, there's something I had as well. I wrote down teachers and lineage because it brings up interesting things about that I've been thinking about recently. That's kind of an important component of finding a teacher can be really helpful sometimes, although it can be kind of hit and miss, because just because you found a teacher doesn't mean you found a good teacher. But sometimes if you do find a good connection, that can be really crucial. Oh yeah, that's what I was actually going to mention is you mentioned sometimes finding something and it being like important, seemingly random, but important and meaningful. And that's actually something I believe in a lot, that I was thinking about recently and reflecting on and realizing it was part of my core philosophy, but where sometimes I find myself in a situation where something happens or something negative happens and it pushes me in a certain direction, and I have to just like stop and ask myself why, or what will come from this if I go this direction. And sometimes it's not a direction I'm wanting to go, but I'll be pushed in a direction sort of forcefully by circumstances and events and fortune, but then it'll lead to something that was really important that I wouldn't have done otherwise. Or sometimes even just a random or chance finding a passage in a book or something like that has been important or like crucial. And I actually think there's things like that that happen all the time in people's lives that they just don't fully realize, because we're not used to noticing those patterns and understanding the importance of them, because they seem like minor things at the time, and it's usually only in retrospect that you realize the significance of something, of a chance meeting or a chance encounter or what have you. But I think as astrologers, it's actually really important that we pay more attention to those things, because it's part of the whole nexus of fate that astrology is very much tied up in. And sometimes that's what the astrology is indicating, is a chance encounter that will be more important than you realize at the time. But sometimes the astrology itself is telling you that something important is happening and that you need to pay attention to it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. But I mean, I'll also add that sometimes there's value in not paying attention to it, right? Like sometimes there's value in letting life catch you by surprise, because I got like, especially with my ambiguous ascendant, like I've fallen down so many rabbit holes, just like picking apart every experience of my life. And like I kind of reached this point where I was like, I need to take a step back and like exist in the world as me, and stop trying to look for what is trying to be said, and just listen in day-to-day life.
There's also like that balance between looking for synchronicities that are like purely astrological versus like, you know, just if it was like some book you were gifted when you were like 6 and you randomly reopened it, you know, and it led you to
random peak period. Right. Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely a balance between, because anything taken to an extreme can be like unhealthy. And I know I've certainly seen, for example, if somebody struggles with issues like that already, where they see things that aren't happening, or they read too far into things sometimes, that you can have like a malfunctioning of that faculty of the mind that can just sort of like run wild. And if you're not sort of keeping things in check, or that it can go to a bad place. So you definitely want to be careful. Sure.
Yeah, I think it's challenging, because that mercurial side of astrology, which is so geometric and fractal, and it's so beautiful because it's always generating beautiful cosmic symphony, however you want to observe it. It's also like, I guess, what's the right analogy? It's like a train wreck, you know, that you don't want to look at, but you can't not look away from it, right? It's like it's beautiful like on its own, but there's a line between going too far with anything that's just not, you know, we're not meant to be only up there, you know, we're down here. So I know for myself, like pretty mercurial person, there's phases of going in and out of that that path, but wandering and maintaining presence in the body is very good, necessary, for anyone.
Sure.
I did just want to backtrack just a little bit, if that's okay, unless somebody had more conversation. Okay. Because you were mentioning having a teacher and having like a good teacher, right? Because not everybody always has the time or the resources to be able to take a course and be certified. And so part of that really involves finding a teacher who you can connect with, right? Whether it's someone's like actual course, or a book in an author's reading style that you can really, really like comprehend and you like to enjoy, right? Whether that teacher is a formal authority figure or simply talking in a Twitter space and someone saying, actually, sorry, Jupiter rules Pisces, not the moon. The moon rules Cancer. Little things like that accumulate over time. And of course, keep a critical eye, because not everything you hear is true. But also just the emphasis on community. There's teachers everywhere. You just have to keep your eyes open for them.
Yeah. I think it's this, again, this tough straddling the line of like, well, you know, if we're saying what's important is knowing your symbol set and being acquainted with it over years of, you know, practice, that you can be confident enough to say something that will probably be true. Again, with astrology, that's hard because we have this like egregore, you know, it's like a collective consciousness that's been in the tradition, and it's been rich with practitioners in a lineage for thousands of years. But at the same time, you know, new schools of thought can emerge and kind of branch off of that, where eventually on the tree, you know, those branches could be very distant, but still simultaneously are going to get to, you know, what you're looking for. So it's hard to really say, you know, you need to just study with, you know, one teacher who really knows their, you know, their stuff, right? Because
yeah, and like, I'm sorry, were you gonna?
I was just gonna say that, yeah, I mean, most of the astrological tradition has been a textual transmission, and sometimes, you know, learning from a teacher doesn't necessarily mean, well, it's nice if you can have one-on-one interaction. Even just learning and studying someone's work and somebody's life's work and internalizing some large part of that can in and of itself set up like a teacher-student relationship. Like I'm thinking of, I don't know, the way that Abu Mashar drew on Ptolemy. So we're talking about two people that lived hundreds of years apart, who spoke a different language and lived in a different area of the world, but there was a close connection and an emulation between Abu Mashar's works and Ptolemy's works. But that's a point that I've made a lot, is that it's rarely about just like learning under one teacher and then completely emulating those methods, but instead, usually anybody's approach to astrology is basically going to be a synthesis of a few different, whatever your primary and most influential set of sources are, especially like, let's say, the 2 to 3 most influential teachers that you learned from in some manner or another, that you really focused on learning their work and learning their approach, that your own approach to astrology will be sort of a synthesis between those sources you drew on and your own personal observations and experiences during the course of your career. Mm-hmm. So that, yeah, learning with a teacher can be not just direct one-on-one learning, but just studying and really coming to understand somebody's life's work and somebody's approach to astrology. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Whatever format that's in, whether it's listening to lectures they've given or reading their books or what have you.
Yeah, and I mean, as long as the person is alive, there's emails out there, there's ways to contact astrologers. Yeah. Even if you have a question, if you're active in online communities, chances are you'll come across some kind of astro nerd who's read all of everything 5 times over, basically, you know, and they can tell you which page of Dorotheus that thing you're trying to remember came from. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, like, you looking for help when you need it. And also, that was kind of why I was saying don't be shy to disagree, right? Because that's part of your own personal practice is going to be shaped, yes, of course, by the tradition. You have to learn from somewhere. You're not just mm-hmm. pulling it out of nowhere. But also, like, you can hear something and practice it one way and not really resonate with it, and see someone else who uses it differently and be like, yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, and it can change over time. You know, mm-hmm. everyone's practice is going to shift and morph with the more you learn and the more you interact with the astrology. But I think it's also, like, interesting because I guess just thinking about, like, that kind of transmission textually versus being with a teacher, there is that important element to which at one point it's like, well, you know, the teacher dies, you know, and the student becomes a teacher. And, like, there's that element where even in, you know, astrology, we have these concepts of, like, fortune and spirit, which is kind of analogous to, like, you know, what you're given and what you create, or the past and the future. That point, the lot of spirit, or the part of spirit, was also called, like, the part of things to come, or the part of the future, in some translations and traditions. So I feel like there is that, you know, crucial element here to which we're only being handed the torch to just give it off again. So there has to be creation and innovation, and especially right now in a time where it is so ripe for all of that, between this merging of thousands of years of different traditions from across the world, and with technology, the power and capability that we have now to run statistical research into these different methods. It's just the beginning of a really exciting time, and everyone's just going to start, the tree is just starting to branch. Like, it's just, we have the big trunks, but I think it's just about to get even maybe crazier.
Yeah, those periods in which astrology, in which there's a transmission and older forms of astrology are synthesized together with whatever the contemporary prevailing paradigms are always really great times in the history of astrology, when it sort of flourishes after that happens. But there's a lot of older astrologers from the previous generation, especially the Pluto and Leo generation, that are starting to pass away now. And so it's something I've been thinking about, is collecting, I've been trying to collect some of those stories and some of those oral histories, especially about that, because I've just been reflecting a lot on recently how different people's stories end, and sometimes their work continues on through their students, but sometimes the telling of those stories still needs to happen in terms of passing some of that knowledge and information down about what happened in the past, and what led to where the tradition is today.
I mean, being able to say not just what has changed, but who changed it, how they impacted the field, what this person brought not only to their clients, but to their friends and to their social circles, is a really important part of not just astrological history, but history in general, right? If you, there's so many ways that this can be taken, but if you if you have a conversation with somebody, you're only going to get so much from that conversation. And that's how a book works, right? It's the same principle. If you don't have that context to the person behind these words on pages, you're missing a big part of the tradition.
Right.
And existing in the world with people. Like, that's not just about the tradition, disconnect from there's almost a sort of disconnect from the world around you if you are so hyper focused on the actual words on the pages and the information that can be gleaned, that you're not really pausing and recognizing who's saying it, what importance this project might have had for them. I guess the more watery side too.
And I think just the more nowadays that we start maybe doing a better job of keeping track of those things, astrologers down the road, hundreds and thousands of years from now, not hundreds and thousands, but hundreds of years, it's like they're going to really appreciate that we took the care to archive those changes and the translations or different editions, because now we're searching back 2,000 years ago trying to figure out who the heck Critidemus was. We don't know, but apparently he was some important transmission figure in the tradition. But
yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, because such an important set of events have happened over the past 30 years, and I realize people will be going back and studying this period forever, for a long time, for many decades or centuries in the future, and that some of those stories are being lost as more astrologers that were active then pass away, and that sometimes those stories, are told while a person is alive, but they sort of cease to be told up to that at a certain point. How to record some of that, or how to preserve some of that, can be tricky.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great project for Saturn and Pisces too. Just like the reconciling and containment of the broadness of the tradition, or the larger scope, and trying to contain that into something that can be passed on or put towards purpose with that larger perspective from the range of time that is being consolidated.
Yeah, and I mean, what's that one quote from Valens where he's sad about his student dying? It's his student who passes. Yeah.
Right.
Can either of you quote it for me? It was something.
I mean, he just says he is doing some technical discussion, and then I think at the end of a book he apologizes for not going into more detail, because he says his eyesight is failing, and he was also depressed because of the loss of his favorite student. So he hopes that the reader understands and like cuts him some slack, basically.
Yeah, and like that little passage, I've heard that discussed like so many times. That has so much value. Suddenly you pause while you're reading and you're like, this is not just an astrological text, but this is a book written by a person.
Right.
Who has their own journey, and there's so much value to that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing with like used books versus like fresh books, right? Like when you get a used book, I mean, if you're into like energy stuff, I guess you can feel the energy of the last person who has read it. Their knowledge has kind of seeped in between the lines, and it's a similar kind of idea here.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in some ways, I almost wish we had more of that from remaining from the ancient text than the techniques are awesome, obviously. It's cool to learn and test things out. But that glimpse into the direct life of what it was like, you know, to be an astrologer 2,000 years ago. And your recent episode on the astrology of ancient Egypt, I think, was beautiful and contextualizing and putting images and thoughts into more people's minds about what that entailed and what an exciting and thrilling experience that was, and societally, culturally, how different that was to what we experience now. That I wish we did have more of that. And so it's so important going forward to document this and talk about conferences, right? Things like that.
Yeah, I do too. I wish there was more of that, because that's one of the reasons that Valens is so special, because he does have those personal digressions, and he also uses so many example charts, including his own and people he knew and different things like that. And we see eventually, as the tradition progresses, like more and more of that eventually, till the point where you get to somebody like William Lilly, where he has like his own autobiography. And then in modern times, you get better and better documentation of the lives or personal lives of some astrologers. But you get a lot more when you also know about like the life and backstory behind the techniques sometimes, especially because sometimes technical discoveries are based on the person's life experience. It's not always that way, because there's that tension between passing on the tradition and just the established, whatever the approach is that you learned. And astrologers often attempt to, especially in more older texts, attempt to pass that off as they inherited it. But there's that tension between that part of the tradition versus your own personal innovations. But sometimes personal innovations come from life experiences, either in consulting with clients or in just like things you've observed in your own life that you've seen work. Like my anecdote earlier of that retrograde through my 4th/3rd house, and the sort of like conclusions that I drew from that, you know, starts developing like a technical doctrine that maybe somebody will pick up and run with. But there's both of those, and I do wish we had more of that in terms of some of the tradition.
And also, like, huge part of conferences is relevant to this conversation today, because like you can watch Austin Coppock in the Astrology Podcast, but do you see him and like talk to him? You get a different idea of his body language, his tonality, his personality, right? Because to a degree, everything that is presented somewhere online or in a book or whatever has been refined and distilled in some way. It's being filtered. But you get a peer behind that when you're face to face with somebody. Yeah, for sure.
Right. Yeah. I mean, for some reason, I was out walking earlier today, and I was thinking about that, though, because I can't, like, for example, I was thinking about recording some of my own story with astrology, where somebody asked me recently how I got into astrology, and I tried to give kind of like the Cliff Notes, the synopsis version, but there was so much more behind that I couldn't even explain. You can't actually even, if you tried to like convey the totality of your life, you can't really, and you can't really convey all of that. So it's kind of tricky in terms of telling some of those stories. So that's just for yourself. Like, imagine trying to tell your own story, but then imagine trying to look at another astrologer and write sort of a biography for them. That could not be even trickier in some ways. I was thinking about recently with some of those astrologers that have passed on at this point, and like how to tell their stories is some of the things I've been thinking about and struggling with.
Yeah. Something that is like common in the field of philosophy is just like reading their like rough drafts, even like their unpublished stuff, the rough drafts, the ideas that got tossed away and they decided that never got published. There's it's a really huge thing. I'm sure that you have access to that. That's like so exciting.
I'm actually dealing with that right now because I have a rough draft of a translation of an ancient text that this scholar did. And over a decade ago, I had an email correspondence with him, and he said he'd send me, he said it was just about finished, and he'd send me, you know, his draft of it. And then I didn't hear from him, and I contacted him again a year later, and it turned out he had passed away. So I had a correspondence with his widows a few years later, and have for several years. And she just finally sent me like the only surviving version of it that exists, which is like a printed manuscript of it, because the digital files may not have survived. So figuring out like what to do with that, and also there might be a second printed version, and it might be an earlier draft from what he was going to publish as the final, and just like how to deal with things like that. It's funny that you mentioned that.
Mm-hmm. That's really cool that that's coming up for astrology too, because that's one of my, as a philosophy student, that's one of my favorite things, is like not actually like your published work, but like your notes, like your journals. Like the journals of philosophers that get published tell you more about their philosophies than their actual published work.
Yeah, I think the personal journal is like the ultimate teaching tool. You know, it's like sitting down, you know, and earlier we were talking about like the daimon, or like a guardian spirit or higher energy that's working with the incarnated, you know, soul to guide and teach and learn. And I think that personal experience of like, you know, your notebook is your own, you know, limitless range of potential for learning and discovering and exploring. And I know for myself, like my own personal notebooks are where I have, you know, so many of my personal revelations or insights, or, you know, that kind of time to just explore and play when you're just kind of with your daimon, like getting to be playful with it, especially with astrology, because I don't think it's very hard to. I think it's so geometric that if you can have something that's, you know, astrologically, symbolically sound, you know, you're gonna find or discover something. So yeah, I think it's just it's great now, like this kind of discussion that we're having, this whole, you know, chat about the, you know, containing time and preserving things for the future, or lineages and the way that gets passed on in the terms of, you know, how students reconcile old knowledge and bring new knowledge forward. Like, you know, this is very much like a simulacrum of the conversations that are happening, you know, at conferences like NORWAC, or in other kind of communal spaces where astrologers can come together and talk about that. So I think this is great that we're throwing a lot of these ideas out for other people to think about, you know, what can we actually start doing to, you know, make that happen for the future.
Yeah, that makes me think though, you know, this other issue I was running into, which is that, you know, what if a person has like earlier versions of stuff that they didn't want to publish and make their final thoughts? And, you know, like, would you want your rough draft of something to be, or your scribblings of something to be the main thing you're known for, if it was something that you didn't yourself think was complete or something like that? Not with that project I was thinking about earlier. I was thinking about this as a separate thing recently of an astrologer who passed away, who had like earlier preliminary versions of something they were working on, but they never completed it, so that they themselves never wanted to publish and make the preliminary version their main thing. They always had plans to do a final complete one, but just like didn't make it, weren't able to do that. And whether what the balance is between like honoring a person's intention by not making their rough draft sort of version of something the final thing that they are known for, versus needing to recognize the earlier stuff if there was something of value to it. I'm not sure how to explain that, but it's sort of connected thing I've been thinking about recently.
Yeah, I mean, like an artist doesn't want an unfinished painting in a gallery.
Right, exactly.
But at the same time, like there's still a process that happens with every piece of art or a piece of literature or a textbook that someone writes, where each stage is valuable to get insight, both from the reader's perspective, you know, if we don't have the author alive to talk to, you know, what their thought process was around why they're organizing their ideas like this. Because, you know, like on our podcast, we're reading through Rhetorius, who is a very, you know, pretty ambiguous ancient figure, from who we just have this surviving kind of compilation from, you know, these early manuscripts and critical editions that were kind of put together. And it's like, we don't really know exactly, you know, the exact order or sequence or methodology behind, you know, a lot of what we are picking up on. So the more that we do that kind of cross-checking or thinking back, or what was the intention behind this piece of art or piece of literature or whatever, that actually can in some ways have more to say than just what the text is saying itself, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Rhetorius is really interesting because there's a constant question in Rhetorius that he's often like does clearer versions of things that there's only hints of earlier in the tradition, but you're often not sure if Rhetorius is just making something more obvious that was already there and was implicit in the tradition, but that we don't have as many traces of because we've lost so many sources. Or alternatively, if Rhetorius is doing something new and him elaborating on some of those things represents a progression or development that's happened later in the tradition. We often don't know with Rhetorius, and it's one of the trickiest things about him.
I mean, I don't have a solid answer on that, of course, but something that we were just recently discussing with Kate was the fact that Rhetorius addresses like derivative houses from fortune and planetary periods, and then
angular triad. He
introduces
a series
he introduces the angular triads too, and he does it in such a way that it's almost glaringly obvious that, I mean, to me it seems like it is, that he's about to introduce ZR, but he never does. He touches on all of the different ZR things, but never quite reaches that point in what he's saying.
Sure.
So
he mentions it in passing at one point in this sort of thing that Levant Laszlo translated that is like Rhetorius's approach to how to delineate a chart. He does mention in passing at one point to do the releasing technique, as is mentioned in book 4 of Valens. So it's like he was aware of it and recommended at one point, but he doesn't otherwise have his own treatment.
Right. But it was interesting because, again, this speaks to what we're talking about with, like, you know, there is that piecing together of like, well, you know, it looks like there was intention maybe behind why these chapters would have been organized like that, but there's just so much ambiguity and so many different steps, you know, in the process of how that, I don't know if you have it in here, but how that book published by the AFA, you know, translated by James Holden, actually came to us from so many other links along the way. But that's just where we're at, you know, right now in terms of recovering a lot of the ancient material.
And also in terms of like recovering and understanding even not so ancient material, right? Unfinished Picasso is still Picasso that would go in a museum somewhere, you know? So even if somebody hasn't really finished this work, it still has tremendous value in their knowledge and how they applied that. And even if from the grave they're scoffing and shaking their head like, I don't know, no, that's not what I said, that's not what I meant.
And I'm sure there's a lot of that happening still.
Yeah.
You know, it's like
Valens shaking his head from the room.
Yeah, or even like the thing about like the 10th house representing the mother, you know, as like a potential mistranslation that, again, brings us back to like, well, if enough of an egregore or like consciousness practices this concept and, you know, over time, you know, it can actually work. And we talked about that too in our recent episode that we did on the lots, which are like these very kind of mathematical and weirdly behaving points in a chart. And there's so many. And we were just kind of talking about how like you know, they started developing more and more of these like specific points where there's a time where you have to just think like someone just thought of this, you know, like someone just had to put their reasoning together, you know, their astrological symbolism in their head and kind of craft something. Like the part of water journeys is like from 15 degrees of Cancer to Saturn, and you know, that distance projected from the degree of the ascendant. And I went back like through my photos and old, you know, just like just looking back at a ton of different moments, and like that point happened to be like super active in all of the charts I was looking at. And it's like, at what point can we just say like, is something brought into the tradition enough because someone said it and enough people believe it, and so it'll work, versus, maybe you can claim some kind of prophetic divine inspiration, and the universe was like, we're going to drop this piece of information into your consciousness now, and it's just going to work, right? Or like how, we don't know how that works, but it's very peculiar.
Yeah, I mean, that brings up, there's all sorts of different ways in which new astrological techniques are introduced in the tradition, and that could probably be a whole episode into it of itself at some point. But, one of them that is tricky is sometimes astrologers looking back at earlier texts in the tradition, they can misread or misunderstand something, and it can end up being a creative misunderstanding that leads to the introduction of a new technique that didn't exist earlier. But sometimes that misunderstanding can actually be creative and can be creating something new that can be valid. I mean, other times it doesn't always have to be. It can be just a genuine misunderstanding that leads to a weird branch in the tradition that might not be as valuable, but there can sometimes be instances where maybe a creative misunderstanding takes place. There was a thing that Robert Schmidt always said about like algebra, not algebra, but a sort of branch of mathematics, that there was this mathematician, Francois Viette, that was going back and trying to reconstruct what he thought was this lost approach to mathematics in ancient times. And he ended up creating something new in mathematics that was actually valuable. But it turned out that his reconstruction, once later scholars went back and looked on it, that he had created something new, even though he thought he was recovering something old. And I think sometimes that happens and is a possibility that we have to keep in mind. But we also have to be careful about the other version, which is that sometimes we can read things into a text that didn't exist. And figuring out the line between the two is always one of the trickiest pieces of that entire process.
Well, and I mean, there's never going to be a clear line in the sand, but that's one of the most important parts about community, right? Because one person can read this and think, oh, X, Y, and Z. And then another person can read this and be like, well, actually, it's Z, Y, X as stated clearly if you would have known this just going into it. I know the obvious seems like it's the case, but it's not always. I'm being reminded, I wish I could speak more eloquently on this memory, but there was a female archaeologist, and there were these like other archaeologists who were really struggling to figure out why women had certain hairstyles or markings on their scalp or something like that. And it took this woman who was a hairstylist just being like, yeah, they're styling their hair. Like those are braids. Like that's your hair. It's not serving a historical purpose. There's no function. It's fashion. And it was like, wow, like that makes perfect sense. Same principle. It's the value of having different voices. And while we may not reach like a true consensus, I mean, we usually do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just brings us right back to the question of what is divination, and if it's ultimately just about the singular inspired moment that a diviner has to observe the effect of something, it's not going to contain a simple duality in the way we want to understand it to or wish it would be so.
Yeah, or the subjective nature of interpretation. I think that's the core theme there, is when you're doing textual studies, if you're reading an ancient text, you're reading it through your own lens of your own vantage point, your own understanding of the language, all the other things like factors, your current understanding of astrology. Like imagine if you're reading Rhetorius as like a modern astrologer, or as an Indian astrologer, or as somebody that has a background in Renaissance astrology or medieval astrology, or what have you, like whatever your perspective is, you're bringing that a little bit to your subjective interpretation of that text. And that's also true if you're reading a person's birth chart, like whatever your life experiences are, you're bringing those to bear for better or for worse on your interpretation of that person's life. So maybe it's just a matter more of acknowledging that the subjective is a major component in astrology, while there are objective features. And I think that's actually really important. And it's one of the ways in which I disagree with like Jeffrey Cornelius and the view that astrology is entirely divinatory or entirely subjective. I think it's a huge component that needs to be recognized as well, because it's not a purely objective phenomenon. There is a subjective component to it, which doesn't make it less valid. It's actually just a different piece of it, and it needs to be recognized.
They just dance with each other, you know, the subjectivity and objectivity, and that's all you can say about it.
Right.
I mean, this is getting a little bit out there, but subjectivity and objectivity are also just one of the same, right? We will never be able to perceive any component of reality unless it's through our human bodies, through our personal experiences, and etc. But just like Schrodinger's cat earlier, you know, like the grass can't perceive you, right? Unless you're perceiving it. It can go the same way, where you have this kind of dialogue of change that happens over time, where I'm taking from this or I'm giving to it, right? Yeah. We have overproduction of astrological literature and stuff like that, like with the printing press, right? Where everybody was giving almanacs and delineations for different political figures and everything. And we're starting to have a similar thing today, but you have this flourishing and all of this going out, and then you have the recovery where the tide goes back and you really, whatever remains is left in the sand.
Right. The wave is definitely like cresting right now.
Yeah.
I feel like we're on an uphill. We're on like this really exciting phase, but it's just going to come back to now is the time where, you know, collaborate, experiment, explore, you know, that's all we can do. That's what we're doing on the show, is just talking about what we think that the book is talking about and throwing charts up and seeing how these things work if we try to interpret them, you know, from our perspective. And that's all anyone can do, I think.
Yeah. Well, and the point also is that the subjective is actually valid and is interesting and is important in and of itself. Like the subjective component to something, even though we're used to in a modern sort of scientific context, that the scientific method is specifically designed in order to control for and to remove the subjective component of things as much as possible in an attempt to establish what is a sort of consensus reality of like what phenomena is actually occurring objectively outside of the field of the observer. Astrology, and blending both of those worlds, shows you that the subjective component of things is actually valid and is just as important in this sort of unique and mysterious way. I think that it is worth exploring.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, I could talk about the scientific revolution forever, but one of the like biggest changes that happened with that is that we kind of saw this digression from things that are meaningful, just in general, have value. And we moved more towards things that are measurable, have value. So if it can't be measured, it can't be gauged, it can't be, it's not valid, it's not sound, it's not reality. And it's only recently, I mean, Thomas Kuhn's like structure of scientific revolutions played like a really big role in starting to like help academic and communities, like collegiate communities, kind of shed that lens of like objectivity is the only important thing out there. But truly, I mean, when the subjective does have so much value because you cannot have the objective without it, right? I had somewhere to take Kuhn. It'll come back to me.
Yeah, I mean, one of the important, so going back to a much earlier thread in our conversations, one of the other important, I feel like foundational principles of astrology is that the location and perspective of the observer experiencing the events matters. And that's a principle of divination in general, but it's something that comes into importance with astrology, that you cast the chart for the location and the time and the vantage point of the person who is born at that moment, and that the arrangement of the cosmos at that moment relative to that specific location is what's important and will give you signs or omens for something that will come in the future. But that, looking at things through that perspective, it's incorporating a subjective perspective, because sometimes people will say like, well, why don't you cast like a heliocentric chart, or why aren't you casting the birth chart for like the sun or something, because the sun is the center of the solar system? And part of the answer is that is because you're casting it for the person experiencing the phenomenon and their location in time and space. and that's part of the equation. That's the thing that's most important. And so I think that's something that would be part of the cornerstone if we were trying to go back and create some of those foundational principles that are true for all astrologers. That would be a major one of them from like a theoretical standpoint.
Yeah, and it's just magical because it's like we know that wherever consciousness is inserting itself, this program, universe, whatever it is, it's gonna keep a record. You know, even though there's no like cosmic data bank like astro.com where you can look everything up, you know, somehow the universe is still keeping receipts for everything and everyone that happens. And I think we all just literally co-create it by being, you know, just by being down here and experiencing that. Like it's just all intertwined. They have to happen together. So as long as, you know, people continue to live and observe and say, you know, at this place and time, this was the effect that happened down here, as above, the chart has to reflect it somehow.
Yeah, and the subjective element of astrology really speaks to like one of its powers, because for once, like the planets are the objective things here, right? Everyone in the whole world has these planets in this position.
Yeah, we have a finite data set, which, well, nowadays is maybe not so finite, but for a long time it was. You know, it was very much like we were given a, you know, a code, a structure, a program that now is just taking off.
Well, I mean, it's still the thing, even if there's a subjective component, that brings us back to the objective component, which is that those planetary movements are happening like objectively out there, whether we're aware of them or not. And that's one of the interesting components, is that you can see astrology working still when you study the live, like biographies of famous people. You can see astrology operating still in their lives, even if they're not aware of it. And that's sort of where the more objective component of astrology lies. That's interesting and provides an interesting, the other part of the more objective component in the phenomenon of it is that it's something that is objectively occurring out there, even if we're not paying attention to it. And that's also interesting and weird.
Right. So the cat is dead and alive. You know, the astrology is working, and it's not working if you don't know it is, but it is.
Yeah, it's both subjectively can have a presence in your life that you're aware of, and it can both objectively be existing out there in ways that you don't. For example, there's techniques that each of us is not aware of or is not paying attention to and doesn't know about or is not using. But those techniques, like let's say timing techniques, there's some obscure timing technique that works really well that's out there, like a sort of clock, like objectively timing things in your life, and you're not aware of it at all, but it's still sort of out there doing something. Someone may or may not discover it at some point or know that technique, but yeah, it's just one of the ways in which astrology is out there operating objectively.
Yeah, and I think just what better a system to have created if you were, you know, the creator than that, right? Because we can still divine with bones, like we were talking about. You know, you can still get symbolic truth, but there's something about that that's not on par with any other system, really.
Yeah, well, that's actually really important, like, because it's that I think makes astrology unique, because there's a question about, is astrology divination or is it not divination? And in most ancient forms of divination, they're based on using chance-like phenomenon or the principle of fortune, which is random and chaotic and indeterminate, and then taking like a snapshot in a moment of time, like rolling some dice, or you shuffle the tarot cards, or you throw the coins for like the I Ching or what have you, and the random or chance-like phenomenon at that moment, especially if you have an important inquiry or a question at that moment, like the sort of time and space collapse at that moment, and that chance-like phenomenon actually, even though it should be random and meaningless, actually will provide you with an answer that is the opposite of that is actually purposeful and is meaningful in some way at that point in time. But it has to be based on randomness. Like, it has to be, all the different forms of divination are the same in that they take that random or chance-like phenomenon and somehow harness it in order to be able to tell you something about the future.
Yeah.
And astrology is kind of like that, in that the chart is rotating, and there's this random moment that's outside of anybody's control in terms of the moment of birth. And I think that is the chance-like element of astrology. But then there's also this other objective phenomenon where the moment you're born, all of the planetary movements and periods that will occur for the entirety of your life are decided and are predictable and fixed. And so you get this weird, that's one of the things that makes astrology unique as a form of divination, and unlike other forms of divination, is it has both that subjective chance-like characteristic as well as an objective one.
Mm-hmm.
So were you saying that the birth could be compared to the throwing of the coins? Is that the idea that you were getting at? That moment is when the random action happens?
Yeah, because it's like we're all used to, like, with horary astrology, like seeing that. It's really easy for us to conceptualize as a parallel to like the tarot cards or the I Ching, because the horary moment is when you ask the question to the astrologer and they cast a chart, and the chart for that random moment in time will mysteriously reflect both the question as well as the outcome or the answer. And that one's easier for us to conceptualize as a form of divination because it's sort of similar in that you're taking just wherever the planets are placed, which seems random at that moment that you ask the question, and then generating the chart, and the chart itself will actually produce meaningful answers at that time. But the birth chart, I think, the way they conceptualized in the ancient world was similar in that, you know, especially back then, the moment of birth is out of anybody's control. It's something that just happens at some specific point when you're born, and that the randomness of that moment is the chance-like element of the divination, and that's that part of that component, or that component of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes me, again, I guess a lot of my personal philosophy is to sort of meld with like different study I've done in quantum mechanics and quantum physics, because it just makes me think about that observation state, which is like when scientists are tracking the movement of like tiny particles, essentially what they're doing is they're just taking snapshots over and over and over again, and they can over time build up like a predictive model of where they think they'll be able to observe something. And they know within a range of space and time they could find it here. And that's like the wave function. It's like the full potential, you know, well for where it could manifest. And then there's that instant that they observe it, and they find it somewhere in that wave function, and it collapses. And so I think the birth is like in the same way, where, you know, there's going to be this wave function potential, or, you know, a window of time where, you know, you can expect to get some kind of outcome. And then it just comes down to, you know, the exact timing of how that's decided, you know, probably by an intelligence, you know, maybe greater than ourselves. Maybe it's a part of our higher self, or whatever you want to call it, the Daimon. Maybe there's some, you know, management that they have in it being able to maybe tweak or specify, you know, the birth second or whatever, and we don't know. But yeah, I guess it just makes me think about how, like, it's, until we observe it as a particle, it's a wave. You know, we observe it as a non-localized, you know, range of space and of energy. And so there's just a continual interchange, and that's what E equals MC squared really is. It's like you can have energy in motion, you know, and it's like that combination of movement and physical matter is they're always kind of like, it's kind of like turning a shirt inside out and like back out. It's like this Klein bottle, or like a weird multi-dimensional right thing that's just like flowing in and out of what we can even understand.
Yeah.
That makes probably no sense. I don't even know what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah, but that's why I subtitled my book like Hellenistic Astrology, the Study of Fate and Fortune, and I didn't really get a chance to, or I sort of ran out of time and space to explain the fortune component, but just that some of the ancient astrologers viewed fortune as subservient to fate in a way, and that fortune in some ways was helping to do the work of fate, but through this chaotic or this random seeming chance-like events, but that were ultimately deliberate and purposeful, even though they seemed random on the surface.
Yeah. Doesn't Valens say like fortune and hope are both kind of like mistresses for fate? Am I saying that right? He kind of talks about how, like, you know, I guess maybe the fortune is like that observation, and the hope is like that wave function where we'd like things to be in life, or where we'd like to find something, and then some outcome has to manifest, and it will be somewhere within that range of what we can expect or predict based off of the astrology that we're practicing and observing.
Yeah, well, and he also kind of says that like fortune and hope are distractions or are things that can lead you astray, because they can have you wanting something that's not possible. But that part of the purpose of astrology, at least for him in this more stoic mindset, was learning about the future so that you know what you have to accept about the future and that you can prepare yourself for it ahead of time so that you're not thrown off internally, but instead can adopt an internal sense of tranquility no matter what types of events happen. And that was part of their like mindset at the time, which then brings up something you were kind of just talking about, or something we could go into, which is that issue of the astrologer making predictions and what happens when you come up an event in your own life and something's about to happen and you can see it with the astrology, and what role your ability to see that as an astrologer has. Because I think one of the things what we're not used to dealing with is that tied in with the prediction and the outcome is the fact that you're an astrologer and you're aware of it. And sometimes your knowledge of things actually influences events in the future in a really striking way.
Something that has really helped me, because I'm trying to be better about not attempting to control things that I can't, is setting up positive things for me to remember and reflect on during dark times, right? If I know this is a good period of time and I'm having lots of fun with friends, take videos, take pictures, and look back at them during that dark time. It's just a little thing, but it's something you can do ahead of time rather than once you're in the darkness of any given moment. Is just kind of set yourself up for an internal positive experience, like regardless of what's happening around. And like bettering emotional habits and stuff like that. But I mean, I found a tremendous amount of value in like being able to look on my calendar and be like, okay, like this day, things are going to change, you know? And I still do find a lot of value in knowing when things are going to be better or worse.
Right.
I feel like that's like the whole point, right?
Yeah, well, it's hard because like you say, we kind of have an influence on it when we observe it for ourselves. And I do believe sort of, I guess just in my own spiritual perspective, that like, as much as we have to question that balance between what is, predetermined and what is of our creation in our life, I think at the bottom line, like something we can say everyone can agree on that's an astrologer is that no matter what happens, the astrology is going to reflect it, right? So it's like, no matter in what option you choose in any present moment, somehow there's going to be a compulsion or like necessity to move in one direction. And I think it's that kind of more like liminal space of being aware of what your transits are, or what your time lords are doing, that invite the opportunity to work with that energy because you know you have to experience it. And I think that's also could circle us back to why remediational practices are so powerful, because I forget who said that quote, some famous name, but it was like, failing to prepare is preparing to fail. And I think with hard transits, it's like, yes, there is an extent to which there are really challenging circumstances in people's lives that are not necessarily always surmountable, or not necessarily that we can, take control of in our own two hands. But I think going back to like what Valens' perspective is just knowing that you have to endure that kind of inner strength, building that resilience up, can do in some ways more on a spiritual level than just letting the mind kind of obsess and fly around about dealing with some kind of difficult situation when, like you said, there are things we just can't control and we have to kind of submit to that.
Yeah, I think that's actually that's something I think each astrologer has to learn during the course of their career, their studies of astrology, is that can be definitely a pitfall of how not to obsess when you have difficult transits coming up, or how to deal with that, especially when dealing with the more predictive forms of astrology that are a little bit more concrete or clear about which periods are going to be difficult or easy? And what do you do, when you have a really difficult period coming up? That's still something I explore myself in terms of how to deal with that and what your reactions are, and sort of gauging your reactions and what's sort of healthy or helpful versus what's not.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, my personal standpoint, I was like into stoicism for a little while, and I was like, I think maybe this might be a path that I want to walk down. And then I was like, actually, you know what? Like, you should be able to revel in joy and suffer in pain. And that's okay. That's what happens. That's what life is about. That is part of the human experience. And trying to stifle that is not healthy, at least for me. And so, like, knowing that you have fun that's coming to the end, right? You get the 5-minute warning at like the skate rink or whatever. You can tell that the movie's ending, whatever you want to give it. Really just taking some time to reflect on how this positive era has prepared you for what may be coming. And also recognizing you can usually start to see some of the threads emerging with like more challenges. Like, you can usually, before it happens, you can kind of pick up on it. Making preparations like around that specific area of life doesn't always help either. So fostering positivity independent of any potential negative experience that you may be having in the future.
Yeah.
Keeping those separate.
I like that analogy of like the 5-minute warning that the skating rink is about to close. And because that's an interesting experience in of itself when you're nearing the end of a positive period as an astrologer, and like seeing that and recognizing something closing down or ending in your life. And reflecting on that is kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of catharsis from that. And I think that's where a lot of the healing comes in terms of the counseling space of an astrology reading for people. I mean, it depends on what someone's going through, but whether that is more like reflective work on seeing how their life has kind of come together and led them to where they are, or if it's just about talking about, the last 2 months and what's changed, it's like that space and time for reflection is that perspective that allows for the door to close and for it to be a separate place in time and in your mind. But I think astrologically, like observing that and like trying to track or understand how that can be predicted or what cycles work behind that, that's where there's kind of this game that we kind of learn as astrologers over time, and kind of, not having to be so overwhelmed by what you're looking at that you're making things confusing for yourself. Because I think it's usually very simple. Like astrology, if it works well, like it should do what it does in a way that doesn't need to be so complex, right? Or take so much time. And I think that's the beauty of some predictive forms of astrology, in the sense that you can get reassurance on the general energy for any period of time pretty specifically. And that's also puzzling because, again, it brings us back to, well, how can that be? But we know it is.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I found that repeatedly in my experience, and I never stopped being a little amazed by that, is how simple sometimes the correlation of a transit or a Time Lord period can be so much more simple, that it catches you off guard in its simplicity and its elegance. Like my experience of like, there was a Mercury retrograde in my 4th house, and I just had this internal compulsion to go back to where I grew up in the house that I lived in earlier in my life. And I didn't think about that transit going into it. It was only as I was winding down and sort of like heading back and heading home from it that I sort of had this moment of reflection of like, oh, Mercury's retrograde right now in my 4th house. Because, sometimes as an astrologer, you think of the more elaborate or like a major event that would be more, you're anticipating something more complex, but actually sometimes the way that both natal chart placements as well as transits and other timing techniques play out is sometimes subtler than you think it's going to be. And I think people often then overlook it because it's more subtle, or because it's something they're taking for granted that isn't standing out for them. But sometimes if you articulate it to somebody else, and you're talking to somebody else about it, they're able to tell you or to mirror that back to you and show you how that's actually a unique experience that not everybody is experiencing either in their life in general or at that point in time.
Yeah.
And in some ways, that's the value of an astrological consultation, is getting that external sort of mirroring back to you from an individual who's objectively like outside of you.
Yeah. And I feel like that's kind of like that Pisces state where it's like, it's kind of the end of the cycle and there's this brief breath of like, okay, it's like the next thing's about to start. Like I can kind of see the whole journey from how it's unfolded. Like even in like the day cycle, to me, Pisces is like just that deep dreaming state, you know, before you're going to wake up the next day. And it's kind of like, that is where we, you know, we do have access to so many, so much internal wisdom or inspiration or memory or kind of weird, you know, it's like deja vu, like the way all of our consciousness is kind of flowing. It's like when we make time and space to, you know, do that for our lives. And you don't need astrology for that, you know, you can just journal and reflect on your life. But astrology, again, it's awesome because it's mapped out and we can talk about it and be scientific about it, but also, you know, come back to mixing the art and judgment because they both play with each other too.
I mean, like, personally, I knew I was going to be injured when it was coming up. Like, I knew it was going to happen last year. I had timed it. I had the week roughly estimated, and I was eternally grateful for that, right? Like, that I had the time to prepare. But, like, there's some things that you can't prepare for also. There's always, sometimes you prepare and prepare and prepare, and to no avail, right?
Yeah. And that's the lesson sometimes, that you can't be prepared for everything in life. And especially even as astrologers, I feel like I'm bamboozled all the time by the universe. We wouldn't keep learning if we weren't, right?
Yeah, so exactly. And so like keeping that cognitive flexibility towards your personal delineations is really important because you may think, oh, Mercury retrograde in the 4th house, like maybe I'm going to reorganize my bookshelves. And that might happen, or you might end up visiting like your childhood home, right? As you were saying. So yeah, just maintaining that flexibility and open-mindedness is like really important too.
Yeah, I think that's actually where freedom lies in astrology. And I've thought this for a while, that even if astrology was completely deterministic, if everything was completely predetermined in a person's life, with astrology, there's too many possible manifestations of any one placement or transit or Time Lord period or what have you. There's multiple different ways in which that can manifest because astrology is archetypally predictive, so that you can never be certain until you actually experience the event, the particular manifestation or the exact manifestation, even if you get really close and even if your prediction ends up being, you know, super close to what actually manifests, there's still going to be something about it that's slightly different than what you expected, because you can't always get all the particulars. You can only get the rough outlines of it. So that may be, even in a completely deterministic mindset, if someone were to adopt that, that would be where freedom lies, is that you still have to probably push for and attempt to manifest the most positive or optimistic scenario possible and hope that it's that version of that, even if it's a bad transit or what have you, because you never know for sure 100% until you're there.
Yeah. And I mean, to me, again, it's like, it goes back to that analogy, like that's your wave function right there. Like your optimization of getting precision is lessened the bigger your wave function is. So if you're using all these techniques and throwing everything onto it, your range of possibility for accuracy in the prediction is actually going down. And this goes back to, I think, what we were saying earlier about the simplicity of and beauty of transits. Like, right, like that's the foundation. When you keep it simple, the prediction is very accurate. And the symbolic systems are awesome. They all do work in their own different ways. And, you know, some people are going to resonate with some techniques more than others, but like transits, I think, are a great reminder that, like, you know, it is simple. It is a language to an extent. And the more that we want to throw onto it, we can discover more, but also like, the more we kind of simplify that wave function and throw our potential for error down, you know, we just increase the error. I mean, so we increase the accuracy in the prediction.
Yeah, I mean, transits are still the most important timing technique for me, and I think is the master timing technique of astrology, because that's the one that is connecting real-time events as they're happening with the movements of the planets in the sky at that same time. And you don't have to accept any other philosophical premises or symbolic things like directions, or which get like, you know, increasingly more abstract or more wild in terms of their symbolic assumptions that they're making, whether it's like a day for a year or whether you're stacking planetary periods on top of each other or whatever. But with transits, it's just like, did this event coincide with this transit? And you can objectively say whether or not something happened that matched that symbolically or not.
I mean, and transits are also really important because it's another way to measure time, right? You know, oh my gosh, it's been a whole Jupiter square, right? I've changed so much since this has happened. Whereas sometimes you might have a tendency to just kind of go through and let everything like pass you by. So yeah, and it's a good reminder to slow down also.
Yeah. Well, I think it's cool too because it makes me think of like how astrology is a language. It's the coolest language because it's space and time. You know, it's like there's in like the ancient, I guess, system of like liberal arts, you had like the quadrivium, which was like a set of 4 different subjects that they would, you know, teach students over years. And you know, you begin with arithmetic, which is just basic mathematics, and then you learn, you know, geometry and kind of this way we can construct the same numbers and ratios in space. And you know, you learn music theory, which is like harmony and kind of like how that progression happens over time. But then the 4th and final one was like astronomy or astrology, which is really kind of this cumulative like synthesis of it. It's space and it's time, and it's like in one unit. You can just say Saturn and you're describing so many different things at once. And I think that's why to pinpoint on transits can be so archetypally powerful, because you're not straying from the archetype in terms of what it's programmed to do. You're not making any assumptions. You're not jumping, you know, onto any conclusions. It's just like, yeah, Saturn return, or you know, Aries rising, or whatever you want to say. It's like, yeah, you're going to be able to say very specific things about that.
Yeah, well, it's one of the really concretely empirical areas of astrology where you can, you know, either look forward into the future or look back into your past and say, you know, what happened during this time period when this transit was occurring, and then connect it with an event that did or did not happen and learn something from it. And I think that empirical component's like really, really important.
Definitely.
And then tying in what you were saying about like space and time, I'm actually really excited for when, like, periodically in the history of astrology, there's some person that comes forward that's like an astrologer and also like a scientist who tries to connect astrology with whatever the prevailing scientific paradigm is at the time. Like Ptolemy was one of those people in the 2nd century where he tried to connect, because he was like a polymath and he was writing all these works on many different areas of science and knowledge. And one of them that he wrote on was astrology, and he tried to situate astrology within the context of the scientific paradigm of how they thought the universe worked at the time. And that, you know, worked for many centuries in terms of what their view of the universe was. And there's going to be somebody that comes along again at some point that tries to do that in terms of whatever the current scientific paradigm is. And I'll be really interested to see what that looks like or what that synthesis is. It may only be temporary, because it may be something where, again, like Ptolemy, centuries later, 1,000 years or 2,000 years, we find out new things about how the universe works that invalidates or supersedes the old model. But at least for a period of time, it'll probably look pretty compelling and will connect astrology with some of the current scientific trends that have developed over the past, you know, century, like Einstein's work on relativity or other things like that.
Yeah, it's a big age we're headed into, and yeah, if 2020 did anything for the world, it was definitely start a new intellectual renaissance in terms of how all these fields of knowledge are about to start mingling and expanding, and you know, the rise of artificial intelligence and just what that's about to do to really kind of turn our world around is going to be really exciting to see unfold over the next few years and decades.
Well, and so like we are only one field of knowledge, right? And within astrology, there's so many different fields. Right now, we're at this kind of awkward stage in scientific progress. This is what I was going to say earlier about Kuhn. I'm so glad we came back here. We're at this kind of awkward stage where even the things that we think we know with certainty, we're having a difficult time putting the puzzle pieces together with what we thought we knew in the past and this new information that's coming into us. And so over the last 30 years, like we haven't had like a really powerful consensus in terms of like quantum mechanics, for example, because there's so many holes and things, and that's leading us to, and space, you know, in its entirety. We're needing to start to reevaluate some different things with matter and all of these givens, right? What was just accepted as true. And so like once the scientific community maybe gets a grip on like what's going on there, I feel like we might have a hard time kind of jumping in before they've kind of settled into like a consensus. Yeah. But like astrology also, I feel like is going through this sort of revolution where we had like the tradition was suddenly almost uprooted, and we were like, hey, like this astrology goes back like several thousand years. And it continued and remained constant for thousands of years, actually until this one person in the last 100 years said this one thing, and then it was changed. Yeah. And so like finding how to reintegrate what we think we know about the modern astrological world and modern astrological techniques and unionize that with the tradition and the history of astrology and some of the different concepts, both metaphysical and technical. Yeah. All of that, I feel we will probably need a little help settling that down before we can integrate into
And I think AI
the whole world.
Yeah, I think AI is going to be a big part of that, because as we are approaching, you know, the singularity, which is sort of this consciousess shattering event for humans where artificial intelligence is going to become essentially on par or stronger, theoretically, or I guess more capable or more powerful, whatever you want to call it, that we're also approaching an astrological singularity in terms of the ability for technology to start not just like tracking astrology and kind of confirming it in its own system, but like this question of where as a human lineage and tradition, we are creating new astrology. Like where is the, you know, how do we define what consciousness is within artificial intelligence? And how is its own consciousness evolution, just like humanity's, kind of accelerating in terms of the way that, you know, it could one day, you know, begin to discover things about, you know, advancements in quantum mechanics or, you know, whatever, making some stupid new Time Lord system that's going to work better than all the others or whatever it is. You know, it's like we're also kind of interfacing that merger of like, you know, science has these fractal parts that are coming together, and so does the astrology community, and these are coming together, and this is all this human knowledge that's merging with AI. It's like it's just too early to really, I think, see how it's going to unfold, but it's a big process of yoga, a union that's brewing.
And understandably, like a lot of astrologers have reserves with like AI and astrology and like the digital world. But like whether you like it or not, like our field is going to have to adapt if we want to bring it forward with us in the next 500 years.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I said on the AI episode recently, was just whether you like what's happening with AI or not, it's going to be one of those things kind of like the internet was in the 90s. And it was like there's some astrologers that like adapted and learned how to use those tools to accentuate or to enhance things they were already doing with astrology, and there were others that kind of didn't, but the ones that adapt tend to be the ones that thrive more. And historically, astrologers do tend to be early adopters of new technology, so I think astrologers will do okay, but I think it's the choice that that some people have, and that we'll see people going different directions during the course of the next few decades, not just with that, but also other emerging technologies, I'm sure, in the not too distant future as well. But I think one of the things in the past 30 years that happened that was the thing that was the most important about the traditional revival is rediscovering the theoretical principles of astrology that astrologers have been taking for granted, especially in terms of some of the technical principles and the technical construct of Western astrology. I think it was the rediscovery of the rationale for some of those things that had been lost or wasn't clearly understood that's the most striking thing to me that I think has happened in the past 30 years. And I've been reflecting on that a lot lately, being surprised in what at least relatively short span of time that astrologers have discovered all of these things about the system that astrologers have been using for the past 2,000 years and where it came from and how it came together. There was another discovery recently about the exaltations that I'm looking forward to announcing soon, that gets another step closer towards reconstructing like where those came from and what the basis was for that and how it integrates into the other techniques. And I'm just continually astonished by how a lot of this has been discovered over a relatively short span of time in just the past 2 decades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the whys of things are so crucial, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, just kind of tying that back to like our earlier conversation is it's almost like foreign to me to imagine like a world with astrology without an answer to why. Like, why is this diurnal and this nocturnal? What is diurnal and nocturnal? I mean, like sect was reintroduced. So yeah, like that whole premise, why is the zodiac in this order? Couldn't tell you. That's crazy. And that's like, there's so much value in the idea that we're going to be able to have answers to not only questions, but things that we didn't know we needed answers to.
Right.
Yeah,
it's
incredible.
all those it's all those technical foundations that are going to allow for more things to flourish in terms of, it's like however solid your foundation is how big the house can be, right?
Yeah.
So it's just going to allow, with more reconstruction, it's like, the roots are growing and the branches are just growing higher. So it's really cool to be a part of that process, where I think we're both very lucky to be.
Yeah, that's a good analogy of like a foundation, because then you building the foundation now that then we'll be able to build more structures upon, or like higher structures upon in the future, now that we've gone back and shorn up the foundations of Western astrology.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. I'm trying to think if there's any other topics we meant to touch on or anything we meant to discuss, because I think we've been talking for a couple of hours now, which is a short podcast. I don't know about you guys and how you do it in terms of your podcast, but I tend to go a little long. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Yeah, some recent.
I never knew.
No, not.
I have no idea where we even are right now.
All right, good. Well, yeah. I will not subject you to that, because you've been such gracious guests who've come here to visit me in the studio. I'll not subject you to a 5 or 7 or 10 hour podcast.
That's okay. I think we'd both be happy to stay and talk, honestly. But
truly. If you wanna cut it here, we can. If you want to take a break, we totally can do that. We've had some really long episodes too.
Sure.
This is how we are all the time. This is what we just talk like this.
This is what you do? Okay.
Yeah,
that's kind of what we do.
That's kind of we're in the car and we're like, so what do you think about like the fact that whatever.
Yeah. Well, tell me about your podcast. A little bit about it.
Yeah. So I mean, like, we're students of astrology, the eternal students, just looking to host like study group, I guess, kind of a deal, right?
Yeah.
Like, nothing. We try not to get too formal. We don't always manage to do that. We like to keep like a conversational tone.
Yeah. I think we just try to keep what could normally be kind of maybe dry or bland or technical, and just kind of insert more life into it. Like, that's really, I think, in our name is Mercury Uranus. It's like we're kind of trying to blend ancient and modern perspectives in practice, and just kind of talk about the ways we're exploring that and finding that come up in our research and our lives. Yeah.
And I mean, like with ancient texts, like this current Rhetorius project that we're doing right now, this is kind of an idea that we want to carry forward into the future. And as somebody who like tried picking up Abu Mashar like 2 years ago and like crawled into a hole and was like, I feel like I can't read. Like I would have loved to come across a podcast of somebody being like, so this author said this like really crazy wordy sentence, but if you just reword it, it makes this much more sense. And so we're just trying to offer maybe like a little hand in places where there might not be as much aid, like understanding ancient texts.
Yeah.
Nice. And recently you've been reading through Rhetorius, I think, as part of your episodes or series?
Yeah. We got the awesome green light from the AFA to
shout out to them also for letting us do this great project. Like, so cool.
Yeah. So we've just been kind of going through from the initial chapters and kind of throwing some of the techniques he's adding onto the same chart and kind of synthesizing his approach. Because I think one of the great strengths with Rhetorius is, like you mentioned earlier, a passage where he's talking about synthesizing, timing techniques, and other passages where he's talking about how you synthesize reading a natal chart. That's lacking, I think, in a lot of other authors, in a way that Rhetorius is really clear and explicit about using a lot of different methods, which is overwhelming and not really reasonable, in many cases, to throw all of that at a chart. But we're talking about what it was they said that they would practice or observe or look at in a chart, and we're just seeing how we can apply it.
Yeah. And sometimes reimagining different things, like, okay, like spear bearing was a recent episode that we did. It was a technique that was reserved for like elites, pretty much. Like, unless you met like every single you checked off every single item on this list, like, you would not have it. But the different lists that are given for what's needed vary from author to author. So what are those core principles that we see being repeated in different places? And how can you apply that to delineation as a whole, rather than just saying, oh, nobody has an angular exalted planet. Even though you have 2 angular planets, nothing good could ever come of this. So,
yeah. I mean, that's a good example, because that technique, like you said, is very specific for offering, like, protection or an indication for eminence or whatever. But like, everyone is kind of, protected in their own way, in their community or in their family, or, and it's that thinking that we apply to a lot of those techniques in terms of how can this sound like a really bland, binary kind of like, ancient way of talking about someone's life or someone's experience, and how can we kind of encapsulate that into like a more lived and embodied experience of what that astrology is like alluding to.
Yeah, we use like current dialects rather than like historical.
Yeah, that's really important. That process of adapting the astrological tradition to modern times and to whatever the contemporary society is like is a process that I think different eras of different astrologers in different eras always go through, and it's one that's kind of important now as society is growing and changing, and how to make some of this material relatable in a modern context.
Yeah, totally.
Cool. All right, so where do you release the podcast, or how can people find it?
So you can find it on YouTube at the Mercuranians.
That's MERCURANIANS.
A little bit longer name, but the archetype serves.
Yeah.
So, and it's also on Spotify.
Yeah. So season 1, we have on like pretty much everything: Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, Anchor. I feel like something else also. It's out there. But
season 2, Rhetorius, we're just live streaming on YouTube.
Yeah.
Right now.
And if you catch us live, we will absolutely respond to your comments. Like, we're there involved with the audience. So yeah.
Nice.
Tune in.
All right. Well, I'll put a link to it in the description below this video on YouTube or on the podcast website for this episode, and to where people can find out more information about you. And you're both also on like social media, right?
Yeah.
What do you have individual like URLs or handles?
Yeah. So I'm Cameron, or Omega Astrology, on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm Stellar Astrology, STELLAR. STROLOGY, however you spell astrology. But I'm there on Twitter mostly. I've been kind of like detoxed from the digital world lately. That was part of my Mercury like retrograde return, thankfully. But I'm around enough to say hi, and I love to talk to people online. Like, I genuinely enjoy like having kinds of conversations with them. Like, sometimes we're in Twitter spaces too. Twitter spaces are so fun with astrologers.
It's like a virtual Zoom hangout, basically, if you don't know.
But it's so casual too. It's really nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
So yeah, catch us online. Thank you so much for hosting us, Chris. It's really been a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm glad this worked out. I'm glad we could do it. And then it lined up with the synchronicity in terms of Mercury conjunct Uranus today and it being kind of a chance thing. But I'm glad we did it. So thanks for joining me.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chris.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast. And we'll see you again next time. Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Mimi Stargazer, and Jean-Marie Kaplan. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through our page on patreon.com. In exchange, you can get access to bonus content that's only available to patrons of the podcast, such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the monthly forecast episodes, our monthly auspicious elections podcast, or another exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. If you're looking to get an astrological consultation, we have a list of recommended astrologers at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrologers on the list are friends of the podcast that have been featured in different episodes over the years, and they have different specialties such as natal astrology, electional astrology, synastry, rectification, or horary astrology. You can get a 10% discount when you book a consultation with one of the astrologers on our list by using the promo code Astrology Podcast. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of SolarFire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. You can get a print copy of the book through Amazon or other online retailers, or there's an ebook version available through Google Books. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine, which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com.